The night is dark and the rain had been falling for an hour. Stacy goes on the app and gets a ride from one of those driving services. She waits outside under the streetlight. The restaurant had closed late tonight and her car was in the shop, so she had been catching a ride into work with Joe. Joe had to leave early, so this was her only way home. Stacy didn't really like doing that late by herself, but she didn't have any other choice. 15 minutes later, the described car pulled up. The driver was male in his late 20s to early 30s. The car had the usual Uber logo sticker on it, and this one had a red K on it as well. She had no idea what that meant, but thought they wouldn't be driving if they weren't trustworthy. She was so tired, and her feet hurt so badly, she didn't notice the pictures or the smell at first. She got in, made sure he had her correct address, put on her seatbelt, and they were off. The driver clicked the doors to lock, and that sound made her realize that the doors couldn't be unlocked from the back seat. Shivers began to go up and down her spine. She questioned the driver, and he said something about it being a child safety feature. Stacy didn't believe him, and her uneasy feeling was growing. It was then that she noticed all of the pictures of the women up and around the front visors of the car. They all looked remarkably similar to her. The driver said they were pictures of the people he drove around at night, and then he would show their picture to his daughter Sally and tell their stories. Stacy was not sure about that, and then she realized what that smell was. Bleach. Her mom would come home smelling like that after working in the hospital. The driver sprayed something towards her, making her dizzy. She passed out for a few minutes. When she came to, she was still in the car with the driver under an underpass in a completely deserted part of town. There were 4 brown paper bags in front of her with numbers on them. The driver awoke her by screaming at her, jolting her awake again. "Pick," he demanded. "What? Where are we? This isn't my house. Let me go." Stacy began furiously jiggling the door, but it wouldn't budge. "Pick," he demanded again more firmly. He put a gun to her face. "Pick. We're playing a game. You must pick a bag. You ever played Clue? I'm giving you one answer. I'm the killer. You will determine the where and method, but whatever bag you choose. Now pick, or I will find the house you grew up in and kill everyone in it." "No. Would you like for me to start with your brother or sister?" Stacy's hand trembled and fear welled up inside of her, but she was too terrified for her family not to comply. "Bag 3, she whispered. Louder. "3, bag 3. "Ah, lots of work for me, but you will live a little longer." He opened up the bag and read the card. Place. The underpass at 4th Street. That's where we are right now. And the weapon will be... He reached into the bag and pulled out a knife that gleamed in the moonlight. Stacy screamed, but was never seen again. 2 nights later, another blonde woman, Jennifer, went missing. She suffered a similar fate as Stacy, only was killed in the park by the pond with a wrench. After 7 women with blonde hair had gone missing, the police called in the FBI. The murders had all looked like separate crimes at first because they had different weapons and locations, but then locations and weapons began to repeat themselves. Fear had taken over the women with blonde hair in the city. They all began dyeing their hair other colors, at least for the present time. The connection was also made that they all had blonde hair and had used the apps on their phones to get rides home. From there, they narrowed it down to the company, and finally, after a lot of legwork, a specific driver only took blonde passengers. The police and FBI had talked it over and decided to let someone go undercover. They had found the K car. They put a tracker on it secretly, while the driver went in to get his coffee. Then they wired an agent, made sure she had what she needed, and she went on the app, getting her ride. Nicolette, the private investigator, had put a lot of criminals away, very dangerous criminals. She was still nervous. This driver had already killed several women in many different ways. The way he killed with ease scared her. Nicolette mustered her courage as the car appeared, with the K on it. She hit her button to confirm that this was indeed the right driver and the right car. Plainclothes detectives followed her from a distance to keep her safe, but also try and catch him. Nicolette got into the car and noticed a strange smell which she identified as bleach. That was an odd smell for a car. She saw the pictures in the car and guessed they were pictures of his victims. She tried to snap a few pictures of them and send them to her partner. Parts of them were blurry, but some were very clear. The driver made small talk and Nicolette tried to act normal. She was getting more anxious with every minute that went by. Her heart began to pound faster and faster. Then as they got closer to the edge of town, the driver sprayed something in the back of the car. Before she passed out, Nicolette hit her panic button. Pick. Nicolette was awakened by the driver yelling at her, giving her the same choice as he had given the other women. Nicolette was shocked and horrified as he explained the terrifying rules of his sadistic version of Clue to her. At the apartment she had set for her cover, there were a couple of plainclothes officers playing her friends pretending to be living with her. The driver mentioned them. She shook. She also knew that she had hit her panic button before passing out, and her backup should have already been there. Nicolette asked the driver, trying to stall him and distract him from his sick goal. She felt behind her and realized that her panic button was gone and that she no longer felt the wire she'd been wearing. "Looking for these?" the driver asked, holding up the box with her buttons and the wire. Nicolette thought quickly and pressed the record button on her phone. She tried to keep the driver talking, but his mind had turned back to his task. "Pick a bag," he said rather insistently. Seeing now that she needed to keep stalling until she could come up with her own plan, Nicolette relented and picked bag 1. The driver smiled wickedly and pulled out the card. "Again, I'm giving you one part for free as I am the killer. The place you pick is the Smithville Cemetery. That's where we are now. The method is boring, but it is what you picked, so I have to stick to the rules of the game as well," the driver said, reaching in the bag and pulling out a syringe. "You have chosen drugs, my dear." Without really giving her time to react, the driver lunged at Nicolette with the needle. It pierced her skin, but she wrestled away from the driver before he could inject her with a full dose of whatever was in there. She kept wrestling with the driver and finally got the syringe from him, jabbing it into his arm, causing him to lose focus. Nicolette was able to make it to the front seat, open the door, and crawl a short distance from the car before the full effect of the drugs overcame her. The police, FBI, and paramedics showed up shortly after that. Nicolette had gotten the entire event on her phone. They took her to the hospital where they discovered that she had been injected with a strong sedative. The dose she received was not enough to kill her, but there were 3 other syringes full of the same sedative in the bag labeled number 1, and all of those together would have killed her. The driver was arrested, tried and convicted, and received life without parole. This was one of those cases that would stick with her for a long time.
I was excited for a weekend of peace at the lake house. This week had been so hard at work. I had been working overtime to close a few cold cases. That was the way it began. Then my friend Julie called and all that changed. There was a girl that had gone missing in the town. The local police thought she was a runaway, but Julie didn't think so. She felt like something was going on. I wondered what was going on in this little town. What happened to this girl? She was close to my age. What happened to her? My mind began to race. I knew I had to help her. I had to find her. It took me a minute to even realize that my phone was ringing. I answered. "Catch me if you can," the voice on the other end of the phone said. "Who is this?" "Catch me if you can," the voice repeated. Then the line went dead. A chill went up my spine. I shivered, trying not to think of where she might be or what might be happening to her right now. A few hours later, I met Julie outside the store where the girl had disappeared from. Julie and I exchanged quick greetings. As kids, we had loved playing detectives together. Both of us had an interest in crime. We went around back to find the missing girl's car. There were definitely signs of a struggle here. The driver's side door was open and one of the windows was smashed in. Broken glass littered the ground, stained red with blood drops, and the contents of her purse were spilled all over the ground. Fresh leaves and broken branches adorned the path a few feet from the car, and they came to an abrupt end at the other end of the parking lot. Julie and I looked closer at the broken shards of glass. I dusted them for fingerprints as well as the window and door handles. I went back to my car and we ran the prints. We got 4 hits from the DMV. One set belonged to the missing girl, Missy Sams. The others belonged to Bo Jones, Mike Stanfield, and Julie. I look at Julie. She explains that she was out with Missy and a few other women last week. Missy had had a hard day and then had too much to drink, so she gave Julie her keys. Julie drove her home. That's also why the police think she might have run away instead of being taken. Missy has a bit of a party reputation. Okay, that makes sense. Looking around the scene further, we found a man's broken necklace with symbol of the local high school and a football charm on it. Maybe this has something to do with it. Could it be that Missy ripped this off of one of her attackers? I was so distracted thinking about how we had to find her. My heart was racing so much thinking about how scared she must be. I almost didn't notice what was on my windshield. I find a single purple rose and a note on my windshield. The note read, "Catch me if you can." I put the rose and the note in my car. They are taunting me now. My hands are shaking, but I am more determined than ever to help Missy and am not going to let the guys stop me. My thoughts are interrupted when someone from the store comes out and says that they saw Bo Jones in the store hassling Missy a few days ago. They had an argument. I asked for more information about Bo and found out they used to date. They had been high school sweethearts, and he played high school football. I asked Julie if she knew where Bo lived. She did, so we headed to my car. Inside my car, we found a box on the seat. Black roses covered the top of the box, along with a note that read, "Stop looking for her or you will regret it." There was tape on the box, and then we noticed the most horrifying thing yet as the box began to move. It rocked from side to side and back and forth. The noises coming from the box were more terrifying. It began to hiss. Unshakable terror seized my entire body. My heart felt like it was going to explode. My breathing grew faster and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. Julie was having a similar reaction. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and opened the box. We were greeted by a severed but still flailing head of a rattlesnake. Julie and I smashed the snake head with a shovel and then take a few minutes to compose ourselves. We've got to find her, and time is running out. We looked down and noticed a tag that fell out of the box for Stanfield Farms. I wonder if that tag could be connected to Mike Stanfield, the prints that we found on the car. I guess we should check out Stanfield Farms first, maybe. Then we can go check on Bo. Julie gave me directions to the farm. The fence was broken, and this didn't look like a normal farm. The buildings and cages looked really weird. I went to the front door and knocked. I spoke to Mike Stanfield. We discovered that they milk rattlesnakes there to make anti-venom. It sells for a lot of money and the supply is short. They also sell strawberries, apples, and cattle. It was an odd choice for a product, but it did move him up on the suspect list. Mike claimed he was out sick from work at the time of the abduction. He showed them a note from the free clinic in town. Julie and I then left and went to check on Bo and see where he was. Bo was not at his house, but his brother said he might be at the local tavern, so we headed over there. He was there and not really in the mood to talk. He admitted they had a fight, and I noticed the cuts on his hands. When I asked him about it, he said they were from a bar fight. He did seem like the type, but those cuts could have also come from the struggle in the parking lot. During the time of the kidnapping, Bo claims he was at a friend's house, but his friends acted like they had no idea what we were talking about. Two suspects, both with flimsy alibis and both with evidence pointing them to the crime scene and placing them at the kidnapping. Leaving the tavern, we were debating what to do next when we came outside to an unexpected and macabre surprise. My car was covered in wilted strawberries, apples, and a ghastly sight. Bright, sticky blood drained down from the roof of my car. There was a half-beaten cow head on the very top. The head looked as if it had been severed cleanly, as if by a professional. I had never seen anything like it. This time we called the local police for backup. The local police also happened to be helpful in helping me answer another question. Why would Stansfield be after Missy? It turns out that years ago the two families got into a land dispute. The Stansfields felt like Missy's family charged them way too much for it, causing them to lose a great deal of the acreage a few years later when the stock market crashed. It seemed like Mike was a leading suspect, but usually when things are wrapped up too neatly, there is something amiss. The police took pictures and our statements. They dropped us at Julie's car and we thought about what to do. If Mike is too neat a suspect, where would Bo hang out? The gym? The high school? Football field? Let's check the high school. We made it to the high school in record time. The football field was huge. Julie started at one end and I started at the other. The plan was to meet in the middle. However, the announcer's voice interrupted our thoughts. I heard, "Leave now and you can live." At least we picked the right suspect, I thought. This is confirmation. I quickened my pace as I looked around. The sun was going down and I could feel that Missy was running out of time. I thought, where would he take her? The only building I could see was the snack shack on the far side of the field. That's where my instincts said to go, so that's where I headed. As I got closer to the shack, I could hear screaming and maniacal laughter. By this time, Julie has caught up with me. I take out my knife and she takes out her pepper spray. We set off an air horn we had found outside as a distraction to get Beau's attention. The distraction is enough for us to get inside. Julie sprays Beau with the pepper spray and I force him to the ground and subdue him. We turn him over to the police and get Missy medical attention. She has scratches that match the ones on Beau's face and the astroturf under her nails. The case is solved. Missy is safe now. Beau had wanted her back and she had rejected him. He couldn't handle the rejection, so he had taken her and tried to frame Mike for it. As I drove home, I was glad for this case to be over. So ready for a hot bath, a glass of wine, and a good night's sleep. However, that was not to be. I had another surprise greeting me on my front porch when I arrived home. A vase with a dozen purple roses, which are my favorite, and a note that read, "Hello." As I'm trying to fall asleep, the question is running through my mind. Who are these from? Is this sweet, or do I have a problem?
The first few victims of the so-called voodoo killer were women. Not that you could tell. Looking at what remained of the bodies after what the killer had done to them, it was difficult to identify what gender they might be. It was hard even to recognize them as human. The bodies initially were just that, bodies, or rather just upper bodies. Torsos with the limbs and heads removed. Even the chest in many cases was gouged and mutilated beyond recognition. When we did finally find some of the other pieces, such as the heads, they were little more than skulls, stripped of the flesh and muscle tissue so that only the exposed bone was visible. It was the sort of depraved act for which someone had to be held responsible, someone that it was my job to find. My name is Detective Nicolette. As a detective, I work not from hearsay, mythology, or guesswork, but from the cold, emotionless truth of facts. Whilst the red-top tabloid papers screeched about the murders, covering their front pages with the lurid splashes about the occult, black magic rituals, and voodoo priestesses, I went to work, examining the real facts of the case, piecing together bit by bit the tiny scraps of evidence that I hoped would eventually allow me to catch and bring to justice the heinous individual or group who had committed such awful crimes. I cannot blame the papers for thinking of black magic. Of course, everything they wrote was needlessly sensationalized in order to sell copies. The mantra, "if it bleeds, it leads," being their typical way of operating. But in this case, they had a reason. There had previously been cases, in the UK and elsewhere, where only a torso of the victim had been found. In other similar cases, bodies were discovered with specific body parts missing. A tongue, the genitals, the left eye, or the right hand, all of which had some significance in occult practices, and were linked to other ritual murders. Sometimes specific organs were removed, the liver or heart holding particular significance in some dark magic. I myself had worked on a case in the past where the perpetrator had kept a ring of human tongues, but that is another story. I suppose it was inevitable that the papers would link these murders, which occurred in early 2019, with the so-called ritual or black magic killings. To lump all of these incidents together as voodoo, however, was irresponsible. Voodoo is a religion practiced by a number of devout, law-abiding citizens who are needlessly villainized by these kinds of stories. By calling them the voodoo murders, the paper only showed their misunderstanding of the religion and willingness to demonize whole communities in order to increase circulation. Again, I prefer to stick to facts. When I first joined the case, there were 7 bodies, recovered over a 6-month period. In every case, the part of the body that had been retrieved was the torso. My first action upon being given the case was to have the waterways where the remains had been found dredged for the second time, searching for any further remains that might belong to the same bodies but had been disposed of separately. The first additional piece to be retrieved was a skull, and whilst the entire musculature of the face had been removed, there was enough information on that skull alone to put me on the scent of the killers. My first move was to have the dental records checked. As you probably know, every human has a unique dental signature. Running the dental records can help in identifying remains when simple identification is not an option. In this case, I received a hit in under 4 hours. By the end of the day, I knew exactly who this skull belonged to, and by virtue of a tattoo that was still visible on the collarbone of one of the torsos, was able to match the head to the body. I wished that at that point I could have released the body, handed it over to the family and let them bury their daughter, and perhaps achieve some measure of closure and peace. Unfortunately, it was imperative that I didn't. Not only did I need to keep the identity of the victim a secret, I needed to disguise the fact that I knew. The girl's name was Amber Short. The fact that I had figured this out had to remain a secret, because I did not want to alert her killers that we were onto them. If my theory was correct, my idea about how and more importantly why Amber was killed, then I needed to keep the information to myself. The following day, I identified a second body, this time from the torso itself. Unlike some of the others, this torso could be almost immediately identified as likely being that of the woman on account of it still sporting a pair of breast implants, which the killers had been too lazy or ignorant to remove. What they had not realized is that every breast implant has a serial number imprinted on it, meaning that it can be traced back not only to the manufacturer, but to the area where it's sent, where it was used in surgery, and in some cases, such as this one, who the implant was eventually given to. By the end of the day, I had a name and had also confirmed the pattern that I had established. The second girl's name was Olivia Hurd, and like Amber Short, she had, up until her disappearance, been a YouTube influencer. It was time to close in on the perpetrators, and in a twist that would have fitted perfectly on the covers of those schlocky tabloid newspapers, I decided to hunt for a killer by using a ghost. The following morning, I contacted Interpol and had them feed measurements, likenesses, and other distinguishing features, including video footage and photographs into their facial recognition software. The guys entering the data were somewhat shocked to discover that the two faces I had asked them to find belonged to dead women. At first, they balked at the idea, claiming it to be a waste of time and resources to use facial recognition to look for people who they knew were dead. "Why in God's name," they asked dismissively, "would you want to search for the features of someone who has been dead for several months?" My answer was short, abrupt, and silenced them instantly. "Because," I said slowly, "someone else is wearing it." The previous day, I had examined the skull of Amber Short. The flesh, tendons, and skin removed from the face had not been slashed or raked off in a violent attack. There were no troughs or indentations on the bone where someone had scraped the flesh. Rather, it had been removed, carefully and with precision. So carefully, one might almost call it surgically. It was my belief that Amber Short and Olivia Hurd, both well-known YouTube influencers with hours of content and scores of fans, were chosen for their faces. Someone who had seen them, admired their beauty, and decided that they not only wanted a face similar to that face, they wanted that face. The question then was who would do such a thing and who would be able to help them? Looking through the subscriber list of both Amber and Olivia, I found one name that stuck out. Paul Radley, a cosmetic surgeon based in Switzerland and dealing with a highly exclusive clientele. Mr. Radley followed the accounts of 17 other female YouTube influencers, 5 of whom had been reported missing. Our other bodies. Relaying this information to Interpol, I told them to check for any female subscribers to those channels whose own social media accounts had gone silent or lacked photographs within the last 6 months. Accounts where the snap-happy owners had suddenly stopped posting photos because they recently underwent surgery. 7 accounts fit that description. I then asked that the GPS data of those individuals tracked from their phones be released. to show me locations they had visited in the last few months. In every case, the woman involved had recently flown to Switzerland. Of course, we could not simply arrest these individuals immediately. How would we identify them if they had undergone the kind of major cosmetic surgery that I suspected them of having had? Instead, I requested Interpol to narrow their facial recognition searches to posts within Europe, particularly countries neighboring Switzerland. The following morning, we got a hit. A woman sitting at a cafe in Milan had been recognized. She was wearing Amber's face. A day later, the woman who had been given Olivia's face, hair, and breast implants was spotted in Paris. Both women, when arrested, told of how Dr. Radley had offered them the chance not only to look like their heroes, but to actually have their hero's face surgically replace their own, along with any other physical attributes that they wanted. Through a combination of pioneering surgical techniques, makeup, and prosthetics, he was able to take features from one woman and place it onto the unscrupulous face of another. For the work to be completed, the clients paid upwards of $1 million. The poor girls whom the features were taken were simply discarded. A week later, Paul Radley was arrested in Switzerland. He was extradited to the United States and a year ago was sentenced to serve a number of back-to-back sentences. It was less than a week into his stretch that a man named Matthew Short, Amber Short's younger brother, who was serving a stretch for aggravated assault, caught up with Mr. Radley. It seems that during his canteen duties, Mr. Short was able to heat a full pan of strawberry jam to boiling point. With the help of several other accomplices, he then pinned Radley down and poured the molten mixture onto the skin of his face. The sugars in the jam made the mixture stick to the skin, scalding, burning, and hideously scarring Radley for life by literally melting the skin from his bones. Matthew Short was given an additional 3 years in prison for his actions. He's said to have laughed in the courtroom and accepted the sentence gladly. On his way out, he was heard to say that with his scars and half blind, Radley would now be very easy to identify in any prison in any land. He said with a short laugh, is going to have a very uncomfortable few years.
A young couple, Jeff and Stacy, arrived at the local cemetery to change the flowers of their deceased 7-year-old daughter, who was murdered several years ago. The killer was never found, but the couple seemed to have made their peace with it. Placing the flowers on the tombstone, Stacy smiled as she began talking about the time they spent together, all the fun and adventures they had. After a few more words, she couldn't hold her tears anymore and requested they go back home. But shortly before exiting the cemetery, Stacy heard the voice of her dead daughter. In shock, she stopped walking and looked in the direction the voice came from, but all she saw was a little girl sitting under a tree at the edge of the cemetery. Out of curiosity, she started walking towards the little girl, but she was stopped halfway through by her husband. He grabbed her hands calmly and insisted that she was just emotional and it was normal that she hears things. But just before they could turn back and leave, the voice of their daughter called out again, but this time they both heard it. Out of grief, they turned in the same direction the voice came from and saw the little girl, this time on her feet. She screamed and cried in the voice of their dead daughter, to the despair of Jeff and Stacy, who had to relive the final moments they had with their daughter in her hospital bed. 10 minutes after, Stacy grabbed her purse and started beating the little girl with it as a means to, in her words, silence the little witch, causing them so much pain. But Jeff intervened just in time before calling the police and explaining to them what had happened. The call was directed to the SCP Foundation, and 5 minutes later, the personnel arrived at the scene. Both Jeff and Stacy were treated with Class A anesthetic, and the little was taken into SCP custody. The little girl in this event is regarded as SCP-2118, or the Lost Child as she was initially called. Although her anomalous abilities can be traumatized for the people involved, she still doesn't seem to pose any threat to humanity in general, which is why why she was given the safe class. SCP-2118 is currently held in standard humanoid containment cell under 24/7 observation by motion-activated security cameras. The holding cell is furnished with everything a girl of her age would require, which also includes 2 stuffed animals, an elephant, and a whale. SCP-2118 is also given the permission to go in an outdoor enclosure once for about 1 hour between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. She must at all times be accompanied by at least 1 attendant. It is important, however, that the said attendant must be a person who has never had children before, and the individual must also be versed in American Sign Language, translation, and usage. No other personnel is allowed to have any verbal access with the subject unless in an approved testing log. SCP-2118 is a young human female, presumed 9 years old. She has orange hair and gray eyes, with a scar in the shape of an open parentheses apparently 9 centimeters long, located on her right cheek. The subject claimed the scar came from a stranger hitting her in the face years ago, but when asked further on the identity of the stranger or what she was hit with, the subject refused to answer these questions. She communicates generally through American Sign Language and, in some occasions, through writing, despite being able to speak properly. On the outside, SCP-2118 looks like a normal little girl. However, her anomalous abilities begin to manifest whenever she comes in contact with a person or a parent whose child died at a point in time. After exposure, SCP-2118 begins to speak in a voice, which is wildly similar to the deceased child during the time of death. This ability and the children she mimics are both referred to as SCP-2118-01. The deceased children are generally below the legal ages of 18, at least according to the records by the Foundation. And oddly enough, all SCP-2118-01 records spoke in the same words used by the deceased children before their deaths. In some cases, SCP-2118-01 just mimics choking, drowning, asphyxiation sounds, and even the formation of blisters in the throat cavity. How she's able to do this still remains a mystery to the Foundation. Perhaps one of the weirder features of SCP-2118 is her ability to look remorseful while she makes these sounds, especially considering how violent the nature of the child's death was. Apparently, she maintains a look of contortion because she's unaware of how much psychological distress her ability might cause the person or parent. On some occasions, she shows some signs of apology and platitude to the parent involved, all the while still speaking. I don't know about you, but I personally don't think she's actually remorseful to these people. But that's something for later. After her initial capture, the Foundation immediately set up an interview with the subject. The task was carried out by Drs. Lavoie and Wu, while Dr. Danviers was the translator. At first, the subject behaved hostile to the interviewers, even insisting they stop calling her SCP-2118 and claiming her real name was Cheryl. But after a while, she was apologetic, pointing out that she's aware of how terrible people feel when she speaks. She even insisted that they glue her mouth together, but that offer was turned down by the doctors. According to SCP-2118 claims, the subject's inability to control her powers always made her mother angry and sad, especially when she mimicked and cried like her mother's dead baby. This drove the woman into a deep depression before she eventually died from cardiac arrest. SCP-2118 was later interviewed again, this time using a D-Class employee labeled D3498, a 27-year-old Caucasian male who was convicted for the second-degree murder of both his wife and 3-year-old daughter. On seeing the man, SCP-2118 first apologizes to him before screaming in a high-pitched tone which abruptly resembles that of SCP-2118-01. The high-pitched scream lasted for 5 seconds before the subject started speaking. She constantly altered the words "Daddy" and "Help me" in D3498's deceased daughter's voice, all the while apologizing to the man in American Sign Language. The D-Class employee obviously looked distressed from what he was seeing. Out of anger, he attempted to break his restraints to silence SCP-2118 shortly before 2 Foundation agents were called in to apprehend D3498. The original interview ended there, but the log continued, Records show that the female Foundation personnel sent to apprehend D3498 lost her son 8 years ago. Unfortunately for her, SCP-2118 immediately changed to the voice of her deceased son. But this time, the signs translated didn't seem apologetic, but rather questioning the agent and otherwise mocking her for letting her son die. This wasn't the only time SCP-2118 exhibited this kind of behavior. Other incidents were recorded via the motion-censored camera. It is an unsanctioned interview between SCP-2118 and an SCP researcher called Anselman. The records show Anselman initially watching the subject as she sleeps, shortly before waking her up by knocks he made on the glass of her holding cell. Through sign language, she asked him what he was doing in her cell. But before he could answer the question, the subject began to tremble in a way that indicates SCP-2118-01 was on its way. After trembling for approximately 96 seconds, the subject took the voice of a prepubescent male, calling out to his father. Anselman was delighted by this occurrence. The joy on his face to once again speak with his deceased son seemed very obvious, but his joy was short-lived. See, Anselman's initial theory on SCP-2118 was that she was the gateway to speak with a deceased child, kind of like the mediums we refer to in modern times as psychic. As the subject spoke in the voice of his son, he tried having a conversation with him, claiming that he was manifesting through SCP-2118. The subject, however, didn't like the assumption, and she made the point clear by asking Anselman a series of random questions, which basically taunts both the living and the dead, before giving a series of sign language, which translates to, "Did you think you could really talk to him?" Then another which translates, "He's dead. They're all dead. I can't be him for you. I can't be anyone." The log ends with Dr. Wu escorting Anselman out of the cell with SCP-2118 staring at them as they leave. Apparently, Anselman was treated with Class A anesthetic and assigned to a different Foundation site. Dr. Wu also made sure that all the records of the encounter were stored securely in private Foundation archives. I only managed to get a hold of this log thanks to my inside source. At least I didn't think much about this particular log, but then I recalled SCP-2118's first log on her abilities and how she claims that she is not in control of her abilities. I personally find that to be false, which brings us back to my initial assumption on the fact that SCP-2118 isn't at all remorseful for the pains she causes others. As a matter of fact, I believe she finds joy and entertainment in seeing others suffer, at least as she exhibited in her encounter with the female Foundation agent. Another conclusion I can draw from these logs is the probability that she is in fact in control of her abilities, especially considering the questions she asked Anselman using his son's voice. Although I do believe both of my assumptions on SCP-2118 are correct, I do still have a question on how she got such an ability in the first place. Could the stranger have been an SCP subject capable of passing or creating abilities in normal humans? Or could it just be that the said stranger was actually a scientist who conducts experiments on little children, as was the case of Mr. Green, the apparent creator of SCP-040, aka Evolution's Child, and Dr. Vastabrook, the creator of SCP-191, the Cyborg Girl. Although I haven't got a clear conclusion on how SCP-2118 got her powers, I am, however, certain that the mysterious stranger has something to do with it. I may be wrong, so I'll let you decide. Did the mysterious stranger have something to do with the lost child's anomalous abilities? If so, how did he do it? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in the next one. What do you have for me? Wow, that's a big one. Okay, I'll meet up with you soon. Evil sometimes dwells in its seldom. It is human who seeks for its activities wherever it lies. The case of the Wilson family testified to this. Bonded by blood, separated by attributes is the best way to describe the Wilson family. Summer vacation was what they'd fantasized about, having a good time, fun, privacy, and an escape from the noise of the ever-bubbling city. The Wilsons got more than they had bargained for in this horrific episode Let's ride on this. It was weeks before the 2019 summer, and the residents of Princeburg couldn't keep their excitement. Princeburg was a reserved environment for the wealthy and upper class. Jill was in the playground of Princeburg with her friends, and everyone in the group was sharing the location for their proposed summer vacation. Jill's friends all had their proposed summer vacation somewhere in Southern America, Africa, and Asia, except for her. She was to spend her summer vacation in their heritage mansion on the Vainsgate Island, 6 hours drive from Princeburg. That was what her family had agreed on. Among the 2 other places on the bucket list for the summer vacation 2019. Mr. Henry Wilson, 49 years old, is a workaholic who barely has time with the family. He was a man who loved the golf club where he met with his friends and potential business partners. He had met his wife, Mary Wilson, at the same golf club, and he was fond of calling the golf club a sacred land of blessings. Mrs. Mary Wilson, 45 years old, the mother of 3, and yet still keeping a sultry and firm body like a lady in her early 20s. She was obsessed with cooking in the kitchen. She spent quality time therein, cooking dishes and doing whatever her hands could get busy on in the kitchen. Knitting is one of her favorite things to do if she is not in the kitchen. She always ensures her family members are comfortable. Zion, the first child of the Wilsons' 18-year-old, a sluggish but bookworm persona. Robert, the second child of the Wilsons, 15 years old, is an inquisitive, charismatic, and brave persona. Jill, the third and last child of the Wilsons, 12 years old, is smart, over-pampered, wants everything, loves being the center of attention and attraction, with a false pride best describes her persona. Jill was anxious about her vacation at Vainsgate Island. It was going to be her first time at the historic family mansion. Henry had sent the cleaning service to take care of the mansion that had been unused for some years day before their trip to the island, and he had ensured they stocked it with the right food based on Mary's order. On June 20th, 2019, the night before the trip, Jill couldn't get enough sleep as she kept tossing around the bed and hoping it was daybreak, and they made it to the island within a twinkle of an eye. Jill possesses strong imaginative prowess, and she is a daydreamer. At the family breakfast, Mary had instructed her kids to ensure not to forget anything and to get prepared for the trip ahead. Robert, who had been to the island frequently, was more familiar with the historic mansion of the family. He knew more about the mansion than any member of the family because of the closeness with his late grandfather and their special time together at the mansion on the island. Zion was ready for the trip with the little belongings to take for the 12 days vacation. Mary, who was displeased with what she had seen on site and complained about getting more stuff, but Henry intervened, telling her to let him be. At the space parked at the garage to convey the Wilsons family to the island, Henry screamed with his little fainting voice, "Let's get going, guys! It's going to be a long trip." "Zion and I are here, Dad," Jill had said. "Let's leave Mom and Robert at home and proceed with the trip." Henry gave his daughter a warm smile and nodded a sign of disapproval, followed by a response saying, "Don't do that, darling, unless you don't want your mom's delicious meals during this vacation." Robert gets onto the bus while Mary, with some packs of cookies in her hand for the road trip, was finding it difficult to get into the space bus because of her hands being full. Zion stepped out to assist her, and she hopped onto the car, slamming the door, making her presence felt inside the bus. "Are we ready for this?" Henry asked with his 2 hands on the steering wheel. Yes, the rest of the family murmured their approval, while Mary gave a soft smile to her hubby. Jill couldn't stop staring at her wristwatch. She had held it so tight in her palms. It was 10:25 a.m. when they left their home for Vainsgate Island, which was a 6 hours drive from Princeburg. Some minutes after driving out of Princeburg, Zion, who was interested in the novel he was reading, Jill was taking a slow bite of the cookies in her hands while she was looking through the window and admiring the beauty of nature at sight. Robert was chatting with his girlfriend on the gram, while Mary sat silently next to her hubby with the full concentration on the road ahead. Each time Henry looked at the rear mirror, he seemed to notice someone running after the bus that was at a full speed, but he wasn't sure and he believed it was his illusion and didn't want to put the family members in a panic mood. With the road sign of "Welcome to Vainsgate Island" in sight after 4 hours drive, Henry announced to the family he would make a quick stop at the nearest gas station to take a few minutes rest and refill the gas for the bus. Robert replied almost immediately, like he was waiting for the announcement. "My legs are vibrating," he said, and Jill accused him of always having something to complain about. Robert, trying to defend himself, said, "Not again," but Mary cut the duo argument short by telling them no more words from you both, which made them go mute immediately. Making it to the gas station, which had no person on site and attested to the fact that the Vainsgate is a lonesome island, Mary walked to the restroom to relieve her bladder from the urine she had held onto. While she was in the restroom, she noticed the footsteps of someone walking in, and she greeted them with a warm hello. No one responded, but she didn't take it personally. She was about to step out when she noticed someone sitting in the restroom's corner reading a newspaper while revealing her face. But she couldn't believe what she had just seen. A face with no form of eyes and was reading the daily newspaper. With the major event of yesterday making it to the front page, she ran out of the restroom and told her hubby, "We should leave now." But he wasn't sure what had happened and resisted with the statement saying, "Let's wait a few more minutes, sweetheart. I need to take some rest." She replied in a hushed tone, "There's someone in the restroom reading a newspaper with no eyes." This frightened Henry and made it to the bus immediately, starting the engine and zooming off. "But Dad, I thought we were going to have some minutes rest. Why are we leaving now?" Jill had asked. "Your mom saw someone with no eyes reading the paper in the restroom," Henry replied to her. "What?" The kids responded simultaneously. At the not frequently used mansion building at 4:42 p.m., the Wilsons arrived at their destination. They felt some relief and thought they'd escape from whatever had shown up at the gas station while they were on wheels. Jill was so happy about being here, she could feel the air on the island, different from that of Princeburg and every other city she had been to. Robert was quick to make his way around the mansion with some belongings and a smartphone held firmly. Mary instructed everyone on what to do and shared portions of the room with the kids. She allocated a much spacious room for herself and her hubby. Jill was not interested in what Mary had to say. She went straight to her closet and became fascinated with the framed pictures she had seen around the room. Luxurious vases and king-size spacious room she had only got to see in the movies. Jill became attracted to a wooden carved box with special designs and was curious to know what was inside. She resisted at first and took some steps to observe other paintings in the room. As she had stepped away from the box, she heard a poking sound coming from the box. Jill was curious now and wanted to admire more and know what was inside the box. She drew the wooden box closer to herself and opened it. She saw some pieces of jewelry in it and a book that had a bolder written instruction stating "Do not open." Jill felt no one was going to know if she opened it or not. She defied the instructions and opened the black hardcover book. It had drawings in it and inked written stories. The moment Jill opened the book, a black cloud arose from her back and penetrated her from behind without her knowledge. She was loving the stories from the book. Each happens in the stories. Jill was imagining it to be real and had imagined her family in the situation of these stories. Every imagination, Jill had a thick, dark cloud released from her into the thin air. "Let's go eat dinner, my little princess," Mary said, while standing at the door to Jill's room. Her mother's statement brought Jill back to reality and she responded, "As you wish, Your Highness." Mary gave a shocked look at the unusual form of a response she just heard from her daughter. They filled the dinner table with meals that complemented and matched the mansion they were in. "This was a big feast," Robert had said. "A big feast indeed," Zion replied, and the family burst into laughter. While eating, the giant pendulum clock at the main living room struck down, making it known it was 8 p.m. Immediately, the pendulum stopped. Jill got flashes of incidents she had imagined while reading the sacred wooden box book. Her first imagination, which was centered on the dinner, which was a sequel to the book. Zion had noticed liquid droplets from the chandelier light hanging over the dining table. Looking up and noticed a bird trapped in the fancy lights, and her blood was dripping on his meal this time. He looked back into his plate with the meal before him and saw a dead black bird with its feather in place of its supposed meal. He screamed uncontrollably and fell from the chair at a shock. Jill gave a secret loving smile for what was happening. She had imagined it the way it was coming into reality. The rest of the family became confused about how the meal got replaced to be a dead bird. Henry ran towards Zion to calm him, but immediately Henry touched Zion. He looked into his eyes and he saw what was an enormous dragon next to him. This further made him panic and ran out of sight. While all this was happening, Jill was the only one sitting calmly, with no form of remorse. No one noticed this. The doorbell rang, and there was confusion about who it could be at that hour of night. The Wilsons were reluctant to answer as they weren't expecting anyone, and Vainsgate is a lonesome area with a few people around. Mary pleaded with Henry to check whoever it was and be the man of the house. Henry, with different confusing thoughts, approached the door but was shivering, and it was obvious. After asking who it was twice with no response, he opened the door with a deep sigh. Henry opened the door, accepting whatever his fate could be. He looked around but saw no one, relieved to some extent, and was about to close the door when he saw a human-like figure standing next to the space bus they'd driven from Princeburg to Vainsgate. Hurriedly slammed the giant door and walked backwards, not sure what to say or do. He told the remaining family members at the dining table that they'll be leaving for Princeburg tomorrow, as this was not the vacation anyone would wish for. Mary nodded to what he said in the form of acceptance. Robert was noticing how calm Jill was with all of this happening. The doorbell rang again. And this time, Henry told the family he saw a human-like figure in an overall position next to the space bus. He advised not to answer the door. Zion was still in a panic mood along the hallway. With all that happening to him, Jill stood up for her room and walked majestically along the hallway leading to her room. "My poor little princess," Mary had said when Jill stood up for her room. She didn't bargain for such a vacation. Jill went into her room and laid on the bed. This time again, the pendulum struck and the shivers went down the Wilsons as a loud sound scared them. Jill imagined another occurrence again. This time, it was an extreme imagination. Henry, Robert, and Mary were about to leave the dining room when the power supply went off for a few seconds. By the time the power supply was back, they saw Mary in the air with nothing holding her. Neither was she holding anything, but she couldn't talk. Robert screamed, "What is going on, Dad?" Henry, perplexed as his son, was peeing on himself. They heard a loud whisper. Henry and Robert stared at themselves and ran to wherever they perceived to. Robert ran towards his room and noticed Jill was lying on the bed. At first, he became scared, thinking she was dead or something. He walked towards her room and immediately tapped her, mentioning her name twice before she answered. Immediately, Jill answered. Mary gained her freedom and fell to the ground, which made her scream out of pain. Mary ran towards the hallway, where she saw Zion still in a panic mood, with his face buried in his thigh. "Let's go," she dragged her son. He stood up and followed her blindly with a blank mind. They ran towards the room that Mary had picked for herself and her hubby. Henry was in there and relieved to see Mary was okay and Zion getting himself through. He had an emotionless face. Jill and Robert stared at each other and he knew something wasn't right. He noticed a wooden box at the corner of the table. Opened. He wasn't sure about Jill owning such a thing. As he walked towards the box, he noticed a hissing sound emanating from the box. He saw the book Jill had read with a bolder written instructions stating, "Do not open," which Jill defied. Robert was quick to remember that his late grandfather had told him something strange might occur in the mansion whenever it's left abandoned for long, and something worse could happen if anyone trespasses on the things that were restricted. This flashed through his memory, which made him more scared, and he wasn't sure if the book was one of the restricted items in the Wilson Heritage Mansion. Robert, still not sure about this thought and what action he should carry out, a scream emanating from his parents' room filled the mansion. It was Henry, who had seen a snake with 5 heads in the bathtub while trying to use the restroom. Every member of the Wilson family was in the hallway. Mary was contemplating if it was a good idea to head back to Princeburg the same night or wait till dawn. Jill was moving towards the kitchen. Robert, who had interest in where she was headed for, followed her without uttering a word. Jill was not in full control of herself. The dark cloud that had possessed her was controlling everything she did. Jill picked up a knife and was cutting the center of her palm when Robert walked in on her. Their eyes met, and it was not the normal eyes of his precious sister. The eyes he saw was red, like brimstone. At this point, he knew something was wrong, and this isn't the same Jill he knew. As the blood from the open cut from her palm touched the floor, the walls around the mansion talked and were out of control. The noise was unbearable for Mary. She lost her sanity and cried. Henry was trying to reach the local police on his mobile phone, but his phone was out of service. This had set more panic in his mind. Robert became upset with the noise. He picked up the chopping board from the kitchen to hit Jill. As he raised the object to hit his sister, Robert saw Jill in an infant form and became confused about it. He staggered out of the kitchen as he couldn't come to an understanding of what he had seen. Robert was at the corner next to the kitchen when his sister stepped out and was heading towards the hallway. He summoned the courage to get the creature who he thought was parading Jill and hit it so hard and probably tried to kill it. As he approached Jill, what he saw was a teenage girl approaching the hallway. As he came closer, she cried profusely. This led to Robert shouting his sister's name, Jill. As she looked back and their eyes met, what he saw on her face made him faint. Zion saw Robert lying on the floor, breathless at a slow pace, called for his parents, but it was only Henry, who was in his right mind, that answered. The duo, after several attempts, could get Robert back to a stable position. He told them what he had noticed, and they all concluded to tie down Jill till it was daybreak instead of killing her, as it was too extreme. The time was 2:15 a.m. They approached Jill with a well-calculated approach, got a hold of her, tied her down to the chair in her room. Robert returned the book inside the wooden box, and the rest of the family sat next to Jill until it was daybreak. They all agreed to return to Princeburg that morning. The Wilson family never enjoyed the summer they had envisioned. Do you like this video? Share it with your friends, and also subscribe to the channel.
A ring of tongues. Had it not been for that one detail, Marcus Lane's arrest would have been perfectly normal. When the police burst through his door, expecting some kind of resistance, They instead found him sitting calmly behind the desk in his study. He was wearing his best suit, was freshly showered and shaven, and was looking just as relaxed as if he were sitting in a hotel bar, waiting for his wife rather than expecting the full force of the police department. He came along quietly and willingly, all whilst wearing a wry, knowing smile. In many ways, it was one of the easiest arrests I had ever witnessed, and would have been entirely forgettable had it not been for that one detail. For before him on the desk, laying there, as if it was a perfectly ordinary thing that belonged on a desk, like a computer or a notebook, was a huge iron ring around twice the size of a dinner plate, skewered onto the ring, pierced through the roots, so that their slender tips hung down, meaty and limp like thick cylinders of purplish flesh, were 15 human tongues. In the open fireplace to his left, a pile of books were burning away to ash. That sort of detail stays with you. By the time we got him to the station, Marcus's expensive lawyer was already waiting outside. He sauntered into the cells with his head held high and a cocky, confident swagger that was infuriating to see, especially for someone like me who is charged with interviewing him. In all my years as a detective, I have never once interviewed anyone who is so unrepentant, so unruffled by the idea of serving a life sentence. Nobody who in an interview concerned with the killings of 15 separate individuals could simply sit and smirk. What could drive a man to not only kill and maim 15 others, but to surgically remove and keep their tongues? What kind of a man does that and still finds the prospect of being caught so completely undaunting? Something about the man's confidence unnerved me, but I took comfort in the fact that it was me who had brought him to justice in the first place. At the point at which I was first put onto the case, 15 mutilated corpses, all men, had been discovered at various points across the city. The only thing that linked the bodies, other than the ways in which they had been damaged, was a sample of DNA found on each. The same DNA in every case and clearly belonging to the same individual. That sample did not match anyone in the national database nor the Interpol records, suggesting that whoever had left their genetic material all over these murdered men did not have a criminal record, or at least had never given a DNA sample. What was clear, however, was that if we could find that individual and take a sample of their DNA, we would have a suspect linked to all 15 murders. The question, of course, was where and how to find them. A question it fell to me to answer. To start with, I was at a loss. I read the case files over and over, looking for a link between the men, for some clue or pattern, some detail other than their killer that linked them together. Again and again, I came up with nothing. The men were not of the same age, race, or religion. They did not share the same sexuality, have the same marital status, or mix in the same social circles. They covered a broad range of economic circumstances and all did different jobs. Based upon the evidence I had, it was doubtful that the 15 men had ever met or interacted. There seemingly was no link. It was not until a month later, sitting half drunk on the floor of my apartment at 3 a.m. and staring at the notes pinned to and covering the entire surface of one wall, that an idea finally came to me. I had already covered the usual questions of who, what, when, and had tried to answer why. What I had not considered up until that point was where. What if the locations of the murders had some significance? I stood up and, grabbing a map of the city from my desk drawer, began to plot the locations where the bodies were found onto the grids in red marker. Standing back, I looked at the points and noticed no pattern, but wondered whether the locations themselves held any significance, whether there was some landmark, some connections between the points at which the bodies had been discovered. I decided to look up each set of coordinates individually to see if there were any significant landmark or point of interest in any of them. As soon as I entered the first set of coordinates into Google, I realized I was onto something. The first few results were maps, none of which showed anything of any real note. The fourth result, however, was a quote from an online edition of one of the city's free newspapers. Opening the entry, I found that the coordinates, exactly as I had written them, appeared in the newspaper in the personal ads. The entry read, 7 p.m. Thursday night. red jacket, Andrew Moulton, 52, followed by the coordinates. The date of the paper's release was 3 days before the body of Andrew Moulton was found at those exact coordinates. Quickly, with my heart thundering in my chest, I fed in the other numbers. In every case, the numbers appeared in a personal ad. In every case, the date of publication was within 3 to 5 days of the body being discovered at that exact spot. These, I reasoned, were instructions, directions of who to kill and where. Who had sent them and who had answered the call was still unknown, but now I had an advantage. The next question was how best to use it. The following Monday, I placed my own advertisement in the paper. I gave coordinates and a description, imitating whoever was leaving the instructions and hoping to lure the killer to the spot. This time, however, the description was of a woman, me. The coordinates I gave were for a coffee shop. Rather than waiting inside for the perp to arrive, I waited, sitting at a bus stop opposite and watching through the window. Earlier that day, I had visited the coffee shop and told the cashiers that in order to facilitate an ongoing police investigation, they were to take no cash orders that day. Every transaction made must be on credit or debit card. Then I waited. In my message, I had specified the time of 7 p.m., just as 4 of the other messages had. At 7:02 p.m., I gave the signal for the fire alarm to be pulled in the cafe. I watched as every customer in the place at that moment got up and marched dutifully toward the front door, leaving their coffees behind with the promise that they could have a free one once the emergency had been dealt with. Then, once they were all safely outside, I moved in, collected every cup, the security footage from the day, and the receipts with records of every card transaction. The cups I carefully packed and sent to the lab, looking for a DNA match. Technically, I should have asked for permission, and legally I was on shaky ground. But I figured I could invent some other reason for following the killer later if I got a match, which of course I did. Once the match was confirmed, it was a case of watching the security footage and working out which customer had taken that cup, revealing who the DNA belonged to. Then I cross-referenced this to the checkout receipts. From the time of the transaction and the credit card details, I was able to get an address and a name. 2 days later, at 7 a.m. in the morning, I was watching Marcus being arrested and seeing for the first time his strange ring of human tongues. My interview with Marcus lasted less than 10 minutes, and I didn't even get to ask a question before he began talking. As soon as I pressed the button on the tape recorder, Marcus began to speak, smiling all the while like an alligator as he did. "In my country," he began, "we have old magic. Magic that you people will never understand, but which some people in your country find very useful." He paused, looking me directly in the eye and fixing his stare on me. Though if he was trying to intimidate, he chose the wrong person to test his skills on. Staring straight back, I refused to lower my eyes or even to blink. Eventually, he was forced to look away. "Imagine, just for one moment," he said with hiss, "that you could know the truth of a man's soul. Know every secret that he might be hiding, every last detail that he keeps locked away from others. Depending upon who it was, that could be valuable information. Now imagine that by removing a man's tongue, piercing it with nails, and saying the correct words over it, you could make it speak the truth. Imagine that in my country there were men we called the scribes who would write with these dead men's tongues as if they were quills or pens, and would write upon the page the true answer to any question they asked. Imagine that to know a man's secrets, you need only remove his tongue. Now imagine," he said almost in a whisper, "that you knew a man who could use this magic. If you were in government, a politician, or an FBI agent, and you wanted answers from a suspect, from a spy, from a terrorist sympathizer, then you might pay that man an awful lot of money to steal those tongues and collect those secrets for you. What happened to the owner of the tongue afterward would not be your concern." "Are you saying," I asked, stunned, "that you are that man? That the government or someone else is paying you to get those secrets from people? Nominating victims and telling you where to find them? So you can perform some ritual and write their truths with the tongues?" Marcus again simply smiled. "If a man like that existed, and I'm not saying that he does, he would have the highest of protections, don't you think? This little investigation would be nothing for him to worry about." That was the last thing Marcus said on tape. The following morning, 2 calls came to the station, one from a state senator, the other from the attorney general. Marcus Lane was released later that morning without charge. He has never faced any further investigation and indeed has not been heard from since. As he left the station that morning, I asked him one final question. "What was in the books burning in your fireplace?" He turned to me and again grinned with that hideous crocodilian smile. "Secrets," he said with a laugh.